Hello, my name is Kelly Asche. I'm the senior researcher at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. And in this video, I'm just going to give a quick interview of a report looking at the education formula, probably more formally known as the General Education Revenue Program, a report we released in March of 2023. So the research question we looked at for this particular project was, does increasing only the basic education revenue component of the general education revenue program benefit certain types of schools more than others? I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but it'll make sense as we go through this presentation here. If you didn't want to go any further, you just wanted the answer to it, well, yes, it does provide more funding to some schools more than others because it's designed to. And obviously at Center for Rural Policy and Development, we're not usually too short on our answers. So there is a lot of nuance here that I'll go through, but the short answer is yes. Now, one of the common narratives around, we'll just call it the education formula, which is referencing the General Education Revenue Program, is, there's all kinds of things thrown around. It is a complex program. And with complexity brings a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of false narratives and ideas about how it works. Typically, what someone might hear is that all the money goes to urban schools or all the money goes to schools losing enrollment. All it does is save small rural schools and it redistributes money unequally. This is typically what we hear. Interestingly, it redistributes money unequally is probably the most accurate out of all these phrases. So in order to kind of understand why that is, we really need to get at least a overarching understanding of how the general education revenue program works. And so bear with me, I'm going to make this as simple as possible for something that is quite complex. So the general education revenue program is the primary education funding mechanism for by the state of Minnesota to our K through 12 school districts. It makes up about 50 to 80% of total school revenue that our districts receive. And it is unequal by design. I'm going to read off a quote that was in our report. From an outsider's perspective, the funds distributed through this model can seem unequal, and in fact, they would largely be correct. Minnesota's general education revenue program does redistribute more money to some districts than others, and it is supposed to. And that's because of the way and the purpose of the program and the things that it's trying to accomplish. And these are the two things it wants to do. One, provide baseline funding to all school districts, so everybody's just getting one lump sum of money per pupil. On top of that, the program provides additional funds to cover high costs. This is anything from school districts that just can't reach the economies of scale. Think of very rural school districts that cover a large geographic area. They have to send buses out, through a lot of square miles for not that many students. And they have to have the facilities, they have to have the teachers and all the programming for not that many students. And so the general education revenue program comes in, kicks in a little bit extra money to help cover those high costs. And that's really why things get a little unequal. It does this, and it is a complex program. And in order to figure out, the amount of revenue that each school district receives, it takes into account a lot of different things. So it looks at student composition of the district. Do you have a lot of English learners? They're probably going to be a little bit higher cost in order to educate. Do you have a lot of folks that are on free and reduced lunch? Research shows that they require a little bit more resources in order to support foreign education, and so they get a little bit more money. Do you provide programming outside of traditional schooling? You get a little bit extra funding. Do you have a huge geographic area that you're covering, and thus your transportation costs are significantly higher? You get a little bit more money. Your age of facilities, property values, that's a big one. We'll talk about that in a sec. Your access to get a lot of local funds from property taxes, and also enrollment trends. These are all things that the general education program takes into account when it distributes funds to our districts. There's 14 components. I'm not going to go through each of these. Feel free to take a look at a report. I kind of give a brief description of each of these components. You can check it out, ruralmn.org. But yeah, these are the 14 components. And you can kind of see just in the names of the components that it's covering a lot of different attributes, characteristics, and circumstances that a district might be in. I'm not going to go through them all here. But let me provide a graphical representation. So, it can be a little bit hard to visualize as I'm speaking. So let me try and see if I can find a way to educate folks on what this looks like. And I'm simplifying things. There's a lot more nuance here, but I think right now it's just important that folks just understand the general concept. To do this, I am going to throw around the acronym APU. That just means adjusted pupil units. Again, it's another kind of formula. They don't, the General Education Revenue Program doesn't actually count students as individuals, but rather weighted. So it's, depending on your grade level, you might be one pupil, where another grade level might be 0.8 pupils. It's in order to reflect the different educational costs depending on what grade you're in. And so just keep in mind, as you're looking at these, like, oh, Hancock High School doesn't have that many students in it. Well, it probably doesn't, but the adjusted pupil units isn't per student. So let's look at how the General Education Revenue Program from a basic standpoint looks. So school districts can get funding from a mixture of two things. The first is it gets revenue from its local property tax revenue. And then the second is the general education program or the state funds. And the general education program provides basic education components. So that's that baseline that I talked about earlier. Provides all the school districts just a baseline $6,728 per APU. This is FY22, by the way. So this is a year behind, but that's the most recent data we can get. And so you can see all school district, doesn't matter what kind of students you have, you all get $6,728 per APU. Now the school district can also turn to its local properties and raise revenue. And let's say you have a district, let's say in the suburbs, around the Twin Cities, or even lake properties out in rural areas, or you have like a really nice mix of industry, high value industry, you can raise a lot more funds per APU. So we have in here a hypothetical high property value district, and they're able to raise $7,000 per APU. But a low property value district, where it might be a small, the district has a couple small towns in it, a lot of ag land, and they just can't raise quite as much. They can raise $5,000 per APU. So you could see there's a discrepancy or a gap between education funding and access for a student. So the state comes in and equalizes this. It says, all right, we're going to help fill that gap. We're going to look at who can raise the most money, and the state's going to distribute funds to school districts to make sure everybody can reach that point of revenue per APU. So the state does equalization. And then it does a third thing. It provides additional funding for the high cost. So you can see here, we have the high property value district. They can get basic education component per APU, and then they get their property taxes. And then maybe they get a little bit more, but not much. And then there's low property value districts. And you can see they get the state equalization. Let's say there's a district that has low property and has high costs. So let's say it has a lot of students, a higher proportion of its students that need English, that are English learners. English is their second language. That requires a bit more resources, and they offer a lot of programming outside of school, and they have a large geographic area, right? They have all these kind of things set against them that just are going to have higher costs. They then get a little bit more, and so you can quickly see here how things get unequal or unfair in terms of per APU funds. But the General Education Revenue Program isn't trying to make sure every district's getting the same amount of money per APU. It's making sure every student has the appropriate access and equal access and resources to an education. And that's the primary purpose and primary goal. So here we go. This is every school district in Minnesota, public school districts. This doesn't include charters. FY22 general education revenue per APU. And you can see there's just a very big range. And you can see the western suburbs here receive the lowest per APU. This is generally where you see the highest property values. This is typically where you see the lowest percentages of students that are on free and reduced lunch, the lowest percentage of students that are English learners. Like, there's all these things that they're just not eligible for because of their composition of their student body and the age of their facilities and all these other things. And then you can see, as you go north and southwest, it starts to go up a little bit. Northern Minnesota in particular, I mean, look how big these districts are way up here. These are huge geographic areas that these districts are covering. And so they get a lot more money to help cover those high costs of covering these large geographic areas, as well as not meeting the economies of scale that a higher populated, highly densely populated area might be able to take advantage of. And so, yeah, you can see northern Minnesota and southwest Minnesota tend to get a bit more. And we just kind of call it unequal by design. This is the way it was designed to be. We're going to go a little bit deeper here and let's compare 6 school districts and look at the composition of those components of the general education revenue program, those 14 components. Let's see what it looks like for each school district. So I pulled out 6 here. I pulled out Grigla here in the orange. This public school district had the highest revenue per APU from general education formula, right around $13,000 per APU in FY22. Pequot Lakes in Northwest Minnesota had the lowest revenue per APU from general education formula in the Northwest region at $7,142 or $43. Moorhead, because I wanted to try like an entire kind of more urban type school district in a rural area, you can see they get about $8,000 per APU. Ada Borup, just north of there, that's an entirely rural county. Doesn't have a lot of lakes, mostly ag land, kind of that typical kind of prairie school district. And you can see they get about 8,500. Minneapolis, I threw in there just because a lot of folks want to compare, like, well, what is Minneapolis St. Paul receiving, right? So, and they get about 87, almost $9,000 per APU, per APU, yeah. And then Minnetonka, I pulled them out because they are the lowest per APU at right around $7,000. This is all FY22 numbers. And so let's look at that. Look at the composition here. And it's really fun to see. So each color here represents a component of the general education program, as you can see, down here. And you can see everybody gets the same basic education. That's that baseline funding, $6,728 or whatever it was per APU. Everybody gets that per APU. But then everything else is completely different. So if we look like Grigla, they get a little bit from compensatory, and then they get a lot from sparsity and transportation sparsity. Again, that is trying to cover costs that where economies of scale just don't work in their favor at all. You got to have the buildings, you got to have the teachers, you got to have the programming, you got to have the buses, got to have all this overhead, but you don't have that many students that you're teaching. And so the general education revenue through these few components helps make up for that. And then they get a bit more from local optional aid, small schools revenue is a component, right? There's all these components, and you can really see how this starts to add up for a school district like Grigla. Ada Borup, again, kind of more of a rural school district. They get some, the compensatory. And just so you know, compensatory is all about the proportion of your student body that is on free and reduced lunch. And so trying to make up for some of those costs that where students come from maybe a poor background need a little bit more resources. And so that's compensatory. And then again, they get some sparsity and transportation sparsity. Local optional aid, that's to help cover property tax discrepancies, one of the equalization components, things like that. Moorhead, you can see compensatory is their big one. Pequot Lakes, they don't get a whole lot outside of the basic education, right? They get a little bit in compensatory, a little bit in transportation sparsity, but that's really about it. Minneapolis, they get a big chunk from compensatory. They serve a large proportion of their student body that they serve is on free and reduced lunch and from poor backgrounds. And so they require a little bit more funding to help make up for the high costs associated with that. And then you can see Minnetonka, it's basically basic education. They get their chunk and a little bit from operating capital aid, and that's really about it. So you can really see how the formula distributes these funds dependent on characteristics of the districts themselves. So let's look at this in action. So we want to get back to that research question. If you only increase one piece of this huge complex program, does it kind of throw everything out of whack, or does it, some districts see much higher increases than others? And of course it does, right? Because we've seen that. And so let's look at a hypothetical. Increasing only the basic education formula allowance of the program. You have all these components, all of these complex formulas, but we're only increasing one piece of it, and that's the basic education formula allowance, nothing else. So the baseline year, like we said, was $6,728 per APU. Everybody got that. And let's say you increase it by 4% year one, and then you do these 3% inflationary increases 2 through 5. And this is kind of something you typically see at the legislature. I think the governor proposed something somewhat similar to this this year. But even in years previous, there's always some sort of proposal that looks like this. Like, we'll give you a big increase now, and then we'll spread it out across multiple years, either inflationary increases or 2% or whatever. So this is a hypothetical kind of based on some of the proposals we've seen in the past. And we're not advocating or supporting any of this. It's more just kind of clarity on what this then looks like as you move forward. So this is what it looks like. Revenue per APU increase by year 5. And you can see, yeah, Some school districts receive quite a bit more than others. So around the Twin Cities metro here, you can see they receive right around $1,100 increase by year 5 in that hypothetical situation per APU. A little bit less as you go out, and then you get into these more rural regions in northern Minnesota and southwest Minnesota, and you're approaching, 1,400 to $2,000 per APU increase by year 5 of that proposal. So yeah, the answer to the question is yes, it does. I don't want to say benefit more schools than others, but it redistributes it unequally for sure. And again, it's designed to do that. But to understand why it does that, just when you're increasing one, I mean, there's two questions here, right? So why does increasing one piece of the formula equal such a large increase? So $1,000 and $2,000, I mean, those are both really big increases. That's 10 to 20% increase over 5 years in the revenue per APU through the general education revenue program. But we're only talking about one part of it. Why is it such a large increase? And then why do some schools get a larger increase than others? So let's start with the why such a large increase. So when we're talking about the basic education formula allowance, there's some confusion, and some people think that that means we're only increasing the basic education revenue, so only that $6,728. But actually, the basic education formula allowance is in 5 components of the 14. 5 of the 14 components are linked to the basic education formula allowance. Obviously, basic education revenue, the basic skills compensatory, sparsity funding, transportation sparsity, and declining enrollment. These 5 components have the basic education formula allowance within it, meaning somehow when they're doing the formula and doing their magic, it takes into account what that number is. And if you're increasing that number, you're essentially increasing 5 components. And those 5 components are a huge percentage of the total general education revenue program funding. And so you can see on this map here, this is every school district again, and it's just the percentage of the total general education revenue program revenue provided to that school district that are comprised of those 5 linked components to the basic education allowance. And you can see those 5 components make up between 85 and 99% of the general education revenue program funding provided to school districts. Huge majority. I think the lowest is 84 or 83%. So again, it's significant. And this is why when you increase only this one component, it makes increases be rather large. And then the last question, why do some districts get more than others? And again, if we go back to our previous chart here where we're looking at the composition, I strategically shaded some of these components in shades of blue, and then the rest are green and a gray one. These blue are all of those linked components to the basic education formula allowance. So basic education, compensatory, sparsity, transportation sparsity, and declining enrollment are all linked to the basic education formula allowance. And so you can see when you're increasing GRIGLA, you're increasing this entire shade of blue. That's a huge increase. So yeah, they're going to get a big increase when you're increasing that much of their composition. Whereas Minnetonka, they really only have basic education. And I think it was $8 for per APU for compensatory, right? It was really small. And so they are going to receive less increase per APU because they have such less that is comprised of the general education revenue program. And so you could see Minneapolis, they would see a nice little increase in this hypothetical because they have close to 7,500 that are linked. Ada Borup, again, about 7,500 are linked, but none of these green shades would increase. They would stay the same. So by year 5, they would still be receiving the same local optional aid per APU that they did in FY22 in this hypothetical situation. But these components would increase, these light blue components. So I hope that makes sense. So long story short, it's a complex program, but the way that it works in this hypothetical, it's actually quite simple. It really is just proportion, it's composition. It's built like this for a reason. It's to help school districts that are in certain circumstances where it just costs more to deliver an education that is equal to other districts. And that's the important thing to know in all of this. And it really isn't a metro versus rural, as you saw with those examples. If anything, it might be a little bit more about property rich versus property poor components, but also is about geographic region, your student composition. All of these things kind of play a role in this. And I think it's designed to do exactly what it's doing. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, cash@ruralmn.org. I'm happy to answer questions. Or if I can't answer it, I know some really smart people and experts that would be happy to assist you and explain it in a little bit more detail. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope you have a good day. Thanks.